All right, so today we welcome back Mr. Andy Hughes from last week's session. We talked about a Christian worldview and the gospel narrative, and so he is back for round two to help us discuss very interesting topic of how do we relate theology to culture. And so there have been a lot of different views proposed. You guys in here may not be familiar with, but Andy, I'm sure you are, with Niebuhr's kind of foundational book on the topic back in, I guess, the 50s or 60s. He wrote Christ and Culture, and it kind of shaped the conversation for decades. And he basically wrote out 5 different views of how to relate Christ and culture, and essentially he almost hints at the one that he says is his view, but he really doesn't clarify it explicitly. He kind of hides it just a tad. So, but anyways, he got the conversation started in some sense, and there have been some other really neat books written on the topic as of late. So, so what we're going to look at today is basically, in light of contextualization, especially as it regards to church planning, church revitalization, and that sort of thing. How do we relate theology and culture? So as we're working through the missional helix for our contextualization model, we're still in the theological reflection quadrant. So we talked about Christian worldview last week. That gives us a basis for what questions we should be asking. And then this session is going to kind of expound even more on that. And so what does it look like to actually engage culture by holding to a faithful theology, but also engaging culture in a healthy way. So we're going to kind of jump into theology and culture. How do the two relate? Well, Matt, that is a phenomenal question. Glad that you asked that. And as Mr. Hughes, I guess I can call you Mr. Hughes or Andy.
Sure, that's right. Andy's fine. Yep.
Dr. Hughes in a couple years.
No. Years.
Yeah. In a millennium for me. So feel free at any time to kind of pipe in. It's, something you and I have discussed before, and so feel free to interject, add some to it. The last slide is where we're really going to dive into more practical things, where I think a lot of what you have studied and have a lot of knowledge on would really help. So a couple books that I brought today that I found pretty helpful for this conversation. One's a fairly new book called Every Square Inch. I'm going to put it here on the screen so people can see on the recording. It's written by Bruce Ashford, and it's basically an introduction to cultural engagement for Christians, and it very much is an introduction. It's a quick read, it's a short book, small pages, but he kind of just does an overview. He doesn't go in depth too much, but he gives us a very simple, short, concise explanation of what it looks like to engage culture, how to build a theology of culture, how to look at our culture, our calling as Christians and engaging culture and that sort of thing. So it's a great little primer on the subject, one that I read through in about a day and a half, and it's pretty good little help. We also have our 2 textbooks to deal with this subject. So Goheen's Living at the Crossroads, especially the last chapter that you guys are actually going to read toward the end, even touches a little bit on today, but he talks about some of the spheres that we engage in as far as our Christian worldview is concerned. And then our other textbook, Facing the Change, the chapters that you're reading this week is actually dealing on Christ and culture and how that relates. So he has so I'm not really going to coy today for the lecture part to cite him a lot, just because you guys are already going to read that in your textbook material. But he has a lot of really good definitions and very helpful as well, especially for understanding kind of the North American context where we are. And the last book I brought, my man crush, Timothy Keller, Center Church, one that I appreciate, and Andy, so you can see. Andy, have you read through this book, Center Church?
I have.
Yeah.
Phenomenal book.
Man,
yep.
I've read through it, and I've listened to it on audiobook twice, and I still am trying to understand the introduction.
Right.
So it's dense, but it is brilliant.
Yeah.
Yep. So I got a few, so I just wanted to bring those in. I may pull those out as the conversation goes, but a lot of the stuff from today's lecture are covered in those books. So that would be good to have on your shelf, interact with. Two, you should have on your shelf if you're doing your homework. So we asked the question, what is culture? So we can, you're in Bible college, you're studying what is theology, and understanding that from a systematic, biblical, historical, even philosophical, if you jump into some grad school stuff, theology. So we're not going to cover that too much today, but we do want to look at how is our theology and us as Christians, how are we to engage our culture? So we need to understand what culture is. I think Ashford has a pretty good definition that I like that is taken from Genesis 1 and 2. He says culture is anything that humans produce when they interact with each other and with God's creation. We produce culture, and at the same time, our cultural context shapes us, affecting who we are, what we think and do, how we feel, is the totality of our life in this world. And so culture is very all-encompassing in a lot of ways. You can read 10 different authors, and they'll have 12 different definitions of culture. It's not, some will say, well, is culture, when we talk about someone is cultured, are they a high culture? Do they go to the operas and, run around with the Bentley crowd, and that's high culture? They know all the art and have been to all the galleries in town and have bought stuff from galleries and that sort of thing. But I think culture is really much what Ashford is hitting at. It's anything that we produce as we interact with each other and with God's creation. I think that's probably one of the best, simplest definitions. If you look at someone like Coy in your textbook that you'll be reading this week, he has a little bit longer definition, and his looks a lot like Paul Hebert, which is another missiologist who writes a lot about worldview and missiology. But Coy says here, how can culture be defined? In its broadest sense, culture embraces all of life, so we saw that in Ashford's definition. It is a design for living by which a society adapts itself to its social and ideational environment. More specifically, it involves worldview, ways of thinking, language and linguistic patterns, behavioral patterns, ways of communicating, social structures and institutions, and motivational deciding sources. Essentially, it is a social environment in which we are born, reared, and live. So we talk about worldview, we talk about behavior, language, all that really affects our culture. And so, and we can take this even further, talk about subcultures. We are inside a North American culture, but Winston-Salem is different from Boston, but both are in North America. Winston-Salem is different from Charlotte, even though both are in North Carolina. The community I live in, Forest Hills, is different from the city of Clemens or from Ardmore, other neighborhoods inside of Winston. So we can take culture even down, but what we're looking at really today is if you're planning a church or revitalizing a church, how are you going to understand the local cultural context in light of its broader cultural context? So that's really why we're trying to train you to become contextualization, say that word correctly, the class name, contextualization experts, so you can exegete your community and the people in it to know what church looks like for them, needs to look like. How do we communicate the gospel faithfully? And Tim Keller, Center Church, I'll read his definition as found on page 110. Well, actually, he lists several definitions from some other people, but I thought they were good to just kind of hit real fast. I like this one. This is by H. Richard Niebuhr in the book Christ and Culture. He says, a river is nature, a canal is culture. It's what we build out of a river. This is page 110 in Center Church. Quartz is nature, and arrowhead is culture. We don't use arrowheads anymore for hunting, but at one time a culture did. A moan is natural, a word cultural. Okay, so I thought that was really helpful to kind of put into perspective. It's taking God's creation, a river, and making something with it, a canal, so that we can navigate the river and control it. So, and another definition from Henry Van Til, culture is any and all human effort and labor expended on the cosmos to unearth its treasures and riches and bring them into service to something. And so as Christians, what are we bringing, what we're taking out of culture, what are we bringing it into service of? And so I would say as Christians, we're bringing it into service of the Great Commission for the glory of God by living out the Great Commandments. So those are just, those aren't by any means the only definitions out there of culture, but I thought those are pretty all-encompassing for our conversation today. So here's the next question, and Andy, feel free to jump in any time for these as well. So, how should Christians engage culture? I'm going to present 3 ways. First, should we be of culture? Should we just let everything we do just mirror the culture and go with it? What would be a negative aspect of that? Either one. You can answer. Charlie can answer. Anyone can answer. We're having good open conversation. It's just us 4, 2 of us in the room, 2 of us in cyberspace. Should we just be of the culture?
Define what you mean by of the culture.
All right, so being of the culture would say, well, if our society we live in has said same-sex marriage is completely cool, should our churches just fall in line with the status quo? That would be of culture. That's kind of a simple example.
So then,
No, well, why can we not be of the culture completely?
I mean, I guess one reason why we can't is, and not just because the scripture is clear on the teaching, but because almost like the pluralistic society is. Kind of like what Andy was talking about the other week about the issue of authority, basically. It comes back to that.
That's what I was going to say, yep.
I think, the whole issue, I think he was talking about, if I butcher it, I'm sorry. I think it was like...
You're fine.
I think it was like nature, society, individual God, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
And he drew like circles.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have in my notes.
Oh, I do.
And then he talked about like that, and I think that's one reason why we can't, because our culture is almost drawing from multiple aspects for stuff, and there's no absolute truth, and then we're claiming to absolute truth. So for us to say that it's just okay, we're almost dissolving our own, I guess, authority. Is that the word? Or we're almost throwing our own credibility, I guess. You know, it's like we're contradicting what it teaches.
Well, in essence, we would be replacing authority.
Yeah.
We would be saying culture is the new authority, which is what society wants us to think. I mean, they would want to say that the majority rule, and so the majority is right. Andy, would that be a fair assessment?
I think you're dead on.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes, sir. In fact, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just reading Rosso today on a social contract, and he was talking about when people come together and form a society, they have a contract on the general will. And so the general will of the people, the general will of a particular culture may not be the will of God. And the majority could very much be wrong.
Right.
And so.
Right. No, that's good. That's good. The majority is not always right. There was one time where the majority of Southerners thought that slavery was okay. They obviously subverted authorities because it made them money, and it was an evil. All right, so next, how should Christians engage culture? Should we be all against culture? Should we see that everything that Hollywood produces is evil, that every senator is evil, that every institution, every nonprofit organization, every group, should we be all against it as Christians?
No.
Very good answer. Charlie, go ahead. I think I hear you in the background.
Yeah, sorry. I just think if we're all against it, then we're not going to get anywhere, because that's people's language. And so if we're trying to share the gospel, we're trying to contextualize, we can't do it without using some good pieces of the culture. So I guess just we can't be all against it because it's what we live in, and we're not going to be effective if we're not. We can't make everybody go back to first century culture. We have to deal with what we are presented with.
Yeah, I think you hit on it. Can you turn your mic up a little bit? We were struggling to hear you a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't hear him.
Yeah, I think I'm the one who could hear you, and I had to squint a little. I got my volume turned up here. So Charlie, just work on your volume, and whenever you think you got it, just say something, and we'll tell you if you write it on. But Charlie was hitting at basically kind of a similar thing. If we have too many voices speaking into it, then how can we really Anyways, I think I'm butchering what Charlie said. But anyways, so should we be all against everything in culture? Well, no. We shouldn't be all against it. There are some things we should be against. But there are things in our culture that the church and Christians started way back when that have kind of become cultural norms, and society has adopted them in a way they have contextualized them for their own use. And so I would say no, we shouldn't be of it completely, but we also should not be against it. And I like what Dr. Ashford says. He says, how about we be in and for it? How about we be in the culture and also for the culture? And he speaks of it in a redemptive sense. Let's be in it as in engaging with it, not afraid of it, dialoguing with it, but be for it because we want to see it restored. And so he's got a great quote. He says, we are representatives of Christ who live our lives in the midst of and for the good of our cultural context, and whose cultural lives are characterized by obedience and witness. And so a couple years ago, I was reflecting on some similar ideas to this, and I heard hear a lot of people say, well, I want to be for the city, and so a lot of churches really focused on social justice and engaging that way. They'll say we want to be for our city, and I say I'm all about being for our city, but I think we must balance being for Christ and for the city. And so it's kind of a little bit of a mantra that I have used for myself, and just thinking through why I'm doing ministry to make sure that all I'm doing individually and even as a church leader, are we doing it for the glory of Christ and for the sake of our city? Are we doing both? And so that hits on theology and culture. And I think it must be balanced with Christ, of course, having the authority and giving us our marching orders, so to speak. So any questions or thoughts on that? How should Christians engage culture before we go to the next one?
No, I would just like to add, because I think a lot of times, sometimes those of us who believe in the depravity of man, we believe that man cannot produce any good, and because of our fallen nature. And in fact, I go so far as to say that's one reason why Hobbes, in his political treatise called the Leviathan, said that that's why you need the authority of the state, is to have dominion over man, because man is very self-centered, and so you need the state to come in and correct that. I really like what Schaeffer and his approach to it. He's like, just because man is fallen does not mean that man is what he called a zero, meaning a nothing. He is still an image bearer that has value and can create things that are valuable, and things are significant because he's created in God's image, even if he's not redeemed.
So an atheist can actually create good in culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which we don't always want to admit that, because we would like to say, oh no, only Christians can create good. But I'm sure there are some great nonprofits that are helping people legitimately for good reasons, that were started by people who are far from God and have even no concept. And so they do it maybe from a different starting point or for a different purpose. But nonetheless, they can create good things, just like the church can create bad things in culture. We won't go into some examples of that, but I think we can do just as well. I won't cite the Catholic Church for 1,500 years, but I probably should have gone there.
That's fine.
Thank you, Martin Luther, for helping us out. So now we're going to kind of talk about a theology of culture. Okay, so now we're going to get into a lot of the theological reflection and look at Genesis 1:26 through 28, coupled with 2:15. So Matt, once you got your Bible out, why don't you go ahead and read those sets of verses for us? Genesis 1:26 through 28, along with Genesis 2:15. So Genesis 1:28 is essentially the cultural mandate, which we've referenced in this class and in others. But read that out for us.
All right. This is the ESV. Okay, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then 2:15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it.
Okay. So we're familiar with the cultural mandate. So before the fall, God creates man, and he basically, the cultural mandate is the idea that here was a command, and I would actually say it's the first Great Commission in a way. It's kind of the first hint at what the Great Commission is going to help us even flesh out and understand later. But 128 says that God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So it's kind of one encapsulating phrase, multiply. And then subdue it, have dominion over it. So multiply at this point, if we are before the fall, then it would imply multiplying worshipers through procreation, essentially. After the fall, it's going to be through procreation, but mainly through disciple making. It'll be through the lost coming to know the risen Savior. So he says, multiply, fill the earth, and then subdue it, have dominion over it. And then you couple that with 2:15, he says, and he put him in the garden to work it and to keep it. And those phrases, working and keep it, tie a lot into worship and obedience, if you look at the Hebrew word roots for those. So this idea of worshiping obediently and taking care of it. And Bruce, Dr. Ashford, in the Every Square Inch book we have referenced, he has a unique way of saying this. He says, God commands humans to change and even enhance his creation, or in essence, to cultivate, where we get the word culture from, the earth. Okay? And so it does not mean that God made a broken system that we need to fix. That's not what it is. Before the fall, he says, I'm going to give this to you, and almost like, hey, I'm giving you a big pile of wet sand by the beach. Go create a sandcastle. But you can't create the sand, right? So we're just taking what he's already made and doing things with it, okay? So we look at the building we're sitting in. You know, this building was built, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, all right? And so there are structural things about this building that reflect that time period. If you go downtown to the new building off Broad Street, Broad and 4th, I think it is, the architecture is drastically different from what our Piedmont campus building is, and even on the inside how it looks. The window, I mean, the walls are pretty much all glass. There's an upper deck roof that you can go, and there's plants on there. If you go to our upper deck roof to where their plants are, there are weeds growing in our gutters. That's so there are differences even in, but we have taken clay and mud and wood and steel and that sort of things, and we've created out of what God has created. So that's kind of in essence of what he's saying. Creating culture is in essence taking what God has already given and cultivating it. If we look at creation, as we look at the creation, fall, redemption narrative, human culture is part of God's good creation, is therefore not bad. So when we talk about culture, in this essence, it is not bad when societies and people use cultural ideas and create evil inside of culture. That's when it becomes bad. That relates to the fall. God also gave humans the capacity to create culture. When we look at the fall, all of creation is separated from each other, both spiritually and relationally, yet remains structurally good, while Ashford would say directionally corrupt. So because of the fall, we're all going in a bad direction, so to speak, in more general terms, if we're doing it without the gospel. So it's directionally happening. We are misusing what God created as sex. We are misusing it as lust. It's directionally corrupt. So that's just kind of one example. And then in the redemption, new creation part of the narrative, God restores humanity and the cosmos. It's a new heaven and a new earth filled with resurrected, fully restored people who Christ died for. And Ashford says at page 30, the redemption that Christ provides reaches into every square inch of God's creation, including the non-human aspects of creation. So, in essence, does a tree need salvation? Well, not in the same sense that we humans need salvation and separation from God, but as it being part of a cursed earth, it is groaning for redemption, as Paul says in Romans.
Mm-hmm.
So, any thoughts about there in the cultural mandate? All right. Yeah, we've discussed this in previous classes. So I think this is my last one before we jump into the meat of it. So what is the Christian's calling to culture? Keller has a great quote in one of his chapters on contextualization in Center Church. He says, to contextualize with balance and successfully reach people in a culture, we must both enter the culture sympathetically and respectfully and confront the culture where it contradicts biblical truth. Engage in a process that he calls practical, active contextualization. And so he lists these, and we're going to explore these actually in a later lecture. We're going to go through each of these a little bit more in depth as it relates more to our exegeting people and that sort of thing. That's a little bit later. But I want to give you kind of a snapshot here. He says we, first of all, we do it in three ways. We enter the culture by learning to exegete, understand, and identify with the people. We challenge the culture, revealing its inner contradictions and wrong values, how it has created bad out of what God has made good, essentially. And then we're also appealing to the listeners in the culture as we present Christ to the answer for what they are seeking. And so his chapter on active contextualization is probably one of my favorites in his book. It's just highly practical, and we're going to jump into that a little bit more. But I wanted to go through this to kind of set up our conversation for today, and this is where Mr. Hughes is really going to speak into. So we talk about relating theology and culture. We need to look at different spheres of culture, okay? And this is pretty broad. Most societies have, and I think I've listed 6 or 7, looks like 7 there. And these are not exhaustive, but these are probably more of what different writers talk about. Ashford, in his book, Every Square Inch, he talks about all of these except for, I think, technology and sports. Goheen, in your textbook, Living at the Crossroads, the last chapter, he talks about, I think, 5 of these as well. And it's really just, he's talking about how does the Christian worldview look at these. But we talk about spheres of culture. These are areas that we create things out of. So the easiest one to see is the arts and media. So we look at Hollywood, we look at movies. This is why we talk about the need for exegeting cultural text and products, because they are things that we are creating that a neighborhood, a community, a people group, a society create. Andy, I know you do a lot with, have studied a lot on Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer, and I know one of his many contributions to Christianity and to just good thinking in general was his exegeting art. And I remember the video series. Is the video series called "How Should We Then Live"? Is that what the video
Right.
series is? Okay.
Yep.
So it's been, almost 10 years since I saw that actually in a class here at Piedmont. We watched the video series in class on VHS, which those things exist still in old antique shops, but we watched it on VHS
Yep.
in the classroom. But he did a lot with arts and media. So how would you say Schaeffer would have advocated or advised us Christians to actually engage with things like arts and media?
Yeah, I think if I recall correctly, arts was one of the most efficient ways for the Christian to understand the alternative worldviews in contrast to Christianity, because it was so accessible to people in contrast to, going to the library and picking up Hobbes or something like that. And so, in fact, even at Southeastern, there's a correspondence there that he had between he and Bob Dylan in the archives there that Dr. Little has been able to ascertain for Southeastern. Yeah, so it's pretty awesome. Check that out sometime. But I think with Schaeffer, as he approached the arts, you've already noted this, he did so with the desire to understand and to identify, and he did it in a respectful manner. And so, but the grid, I think, from which he evaluated art, and he would even affirm that even non-Christians could make good art that was consistent with what he called the form of the art, and then the content. As long as the form was corresponding to the content, then it was good art, even if it was something that we may disagree with, if that makes sense. So But with that being said, I think the way that he would approach it, in a way, if you look at his works, even his discussion on art in the Bible, those works were not to be taken out of context um, from what he had written in, for example, the book He Is There and Is Not Silent. And I went over this a little bit with the students, and this is where I get a lot of my stuff from with Schaeffer, so I'm just regurgitating a lot of Schaeffer, is his approach to metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics or value. And so when you look at art, when you listen to music, or you're watching a movie, or whatever, you're really asking the question, what is this artist placing value upon? And what is this saying about what they view as ultimate reality, as ultimately what is real? So, for example, Van Gogh. I don't know if you guys have ever seen any Van Gogh. I was just reading this Schaeffer last night preparing for this, but he talks about how Van Gogh did a lot of selfies, did a lot of self-portraits. But then, as you look at the progression in his life, due to his view of reality, he began to depict himself as less than human, so to speak. And so, I guess to kind of wrap it up, when you're looking at what people are creating, you're examining and you're asking respectfully, what is it that they are conveying, that they are placing value upon, and what is the basis for that value? And that's the questions you're wanting to ask. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I think that um, as Christians, we sometimes want to overanalyze a
Right.
piece of art or a song or something like that, and try to impose some meaning to it that may not really be there.
Right.
We're hunting down something where really we just need to step back and almost get into the painter's shoes and say, okay, what was going on in his life? Like with Van Gogh, what's going on? So when I can't, I really can't listen to a lot of Christian radio, not because I'm against it, but when 92% is really fluffy, I can't stomach it. But I do like to listen to a lot of secular radio to hear what culture is saying, because music, especially in a lot of ways, both reflects and drives a cultural mood on certain topics. And so you had a song like Hosier's "Take Me to Church" that was breaking not even 6, 7, 8 months before the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. But Hosier was basically lambasting the church for wanting to kill gays in a kind of, if you watch his videos, kind of what he's depicting is that we hate them so bad, and it's the church's fault. Which I would say he has not done his part to actually exegete the church. But anyways, it goes both ways. But I think we sometimes want to overimpose some things. We really just need to step in and say, okay, what's going on holistically in this person's life, in their career? What's going on in culture, and how is it reflecting it? Because arts and media, like you said at the beginning, Andy, with Schaeffer, is that it's an easy way to communicate things. It's visual. That's why Instagram is so popular. That's why a tweet with a picture gets more likes and interaction than just words. It's because we're a visual society. And so art is a very powerful thing. So let's talk about the sciences. We look at the sciences and we want to go immediately to combating Darwinism, right? That's what we think, and we say, well, the Bible and science disagree. They can't get along. And I don't want to go into too much on things about theistic evolution, but I just kind of want to mention for the sciences that it also deals with things like anthropology and sociology, psychology, even those things. How do we look at those sciences and use this with a Christian worldview? Is Christian counseling just proof texting the Bible and saying, oh, you're feeling bad, or read this verse and feel happy? Or is it actually exegeting that person's history and background and other things that secular psychology would help us to understand. So there's a lot that go into the sciences, politics in the public square. And Andy, I may let you weigh in on politics and public square. That's really not my domain, but I know you have some history wisdom in that noggin of yours, especially when it comes to things like this. So, how how would you say we as a church should engage something like politics, for instance, especially when we have a very
Yeah.
interesting election coming up with some crazy Republicans. I'm gonna be honest. There's some crazy people that scare me to
Yeah.
death, and I don't know.
Right.
I'm gonna vote for Mickey Mouse again. He's my steady in all this. So what would you say?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, let me offer a caveat. Is I think that there are people that can be Christians and disagree how we engage in a political manner. Let me just throw that out there. Um, I think let me throw out some possibilities. um, there are some out there that say we should not engage. Um, what are the implications of that? I think in Scripture we definitely see God putting, for example, Joseph in a very political context, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a political context, Jesus in a political context when he was brought to trial. You can't escape politics. But then, on the other side, there are those, and I think this is where sometimes some have gotten a bad taste in their mouth within the church about engaging politics, is, well, if we can change things from the top, then we can create a more righteous culture. And, I think taking that approach was somewhat what the Pharisees tried to do in some regards. And so, I think, where does that leave us in engaging culture? I think, and specifically in the area of politics, um, I think the safe way to go about it, as you look at the Scripture, is looking at engaging politics by way of being a witness and a witness of the righteousness of God. I find it interesting that in Acts, the author of Acts several times talks about the church being a witness. And so I think that our involvement in politics, while I think we should work to have laws that protect the rights of people and things of that nature, and limits the depravity of man and how far we can go. How far do we do that? I mean, Israel tried for a couple of thousand years to have something that worked, and it didn't work. And so, I think at least the way I approach it is we should be very active in politics, but active in being a witness to the righteousness of God.
Mm. No, that's good because there are a lot in politics, and then
And not, I mean, if I may, and not the righteousness and judgment of the church, but the righteousness and judgment of God.
right, yeah. So kind of we could almost go into the separation of church and state debate, which
Right.
I think has been sorely misapplied by what Thomas Jefferson meant to the Church of Danbury, but
Right,
I
right.
think I think that whole thing has gotten way out of hand. But it's really saying that not everything in politics is bad. There's a lot of good in government. Romans 13. Paul advocates that we not only pray, but we actually submit to our leaders. And I would say we submit to the point where it is driving evil. And at some point there needs to be things like revolutions and things that happen. I think probably the majority are not necessary. But when you have fallen people leading fallen structures, there's going to be issues. But there's a lot of good in politics. There's a lot of good that come from laws that are passed to help people, and not just laws that benefit the church on a tax exemption place, but gives the church freedom to do a lot more good for its community. And so I'm very thankful for Christian politicians. I'm not thankful for the ones who use Christianity and God as a token to get into. So, and I'm not going to name any kind of candidate right now who's doing that, but if you pay any attention at all to any of the conversation happening, it seems pretty evident that there are those who are basically saying, "Oh yes, I'm a Christian, but I don't need to repent of my sins." Well, then you aren't a Christian. So, just it's fine with saying who you are. Just don't use Christianity as a token because you want an evangelical vote. So as Christians, I think we need to be aware of that. We need to understand the politicians and look at their history, and obviously even for us, don't vote for the candidate who happens to be the Southern Baptist pastor as well. You know, he may not be the best fit to lead this nation. I'm not using that as an endorsement or non-endorsement. I'm not really going to get into that, but we can say, oh, he was a Baptist preacher back in the day. He needs to be the next president. He may be a horrible president. I would agree with him on many things. So I'm glad, Andy, that you addressed more of politics. That's really not my domain.
Yeah. And one more thing, if I could, just to highlight what you said, something came to mind. I forgot where I read it the other day. I can't take credit for this, but someone I read said, you know, we stand for Christian values and Christian truths, not for utilitarian purposes of gaining power, but because it's true. And I think a lot of times if we're using Christian values to gain power, then we just bring reproach upon the God of all power.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
If that makes sense.
It does. We do it because it is right and it's good because our authority in Scripture, God says so.
It's true,
yeah.
right? It's true. We may not be in a position of power. We may not, or we may be in a position of power at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But we do not ultimately proclaim Christianity to get power. In fact, one could say that if you proclaim the message of Christ in this world, you'll find yourself on a cross in most instances. So
someone said that. I can't remember who.
Yeah.
In the Bible.
Right.
Yeah. No. That's good. And it really, I mean, we can translate a lot of that conversation on politics into things like economics and business. Don't just start a business as a Christian to be a millionaire. What if you actually start a business with the mindset of it's going to help people? Yeah, it's going to provide income for my family, but it's also going to serve a redemptive purpose. And now I'll say this too, because we got only about 5 more minutes before we need to wrap up. But when it comes to economics and business, if you're planning a church in a lower income area, no matter what city across the U.S. or Canada or anywhere else that you're in, you need to realize that there are economic systems that are hurting the people of that community, that many of them that you would just say, oh, just go out and get a job. That may not be the case. And so there are systemic structures that are broken as well. Exegeting and understanding that before you just say, oh, we just need to help you find a job. Well, there are deeper issues happening that are dividing families and keeping many in poverty. So that's something to keep in mind. Scholarship and education is another sphere, and if we had more time, we could go into this for another hour on education. But how do we, as Christians, do we just start a bunch of Christian schools and think that every university needs to be Christian? I don't think so. Do our kids need to go to a Christian school? I don't think so. I think some are good. Christian school is a good option for them, and that's best for that family, according to how the family wants to disciple their kids in Deuteronomy 6. And I think there are some times when the public school is the better option, and homeschool as well. So when we talk about scholarship and education, it's another area that we try to put limits on. And and I'll use this as an example. I had a professor that was here at Piedmont when I was, and he left angrily. But he actually wanted me to break up with my girlfriend, who's my wife now, because she went to Wake Forest University. It was a secular school. And he actually told me, he's like, you need to break up with her, and you need to date this girl over here because she wants to be a missionary pastor's wife. And I said, well, what if Jill does too? Just because she's studying business at Wake Forest and can run circles around you intellectually, I'm not going to go there. Why can't she be? But it was a faulty idea that everything had to be a Christian spin on it, and his Christianity was actually very poor, I would say, and it didn't help. So, anyways, I'm not going to name that person. He's been gone from here for years, but that happened. So as we wrap up, technology, that's another sphere that is ever growing and evolving, and so that's actually what my dissertation is dealing with is how our new churches are we contextualizing our use of Web 2.0 and digital media, social media well. So that's where my dissertation is kind of going. So in like 18 years, when I'm done with it, you can read that maybe if I finish. And then sports and recreation, I'll just say hashtag Super Bowl. Um, is that not a sphere of influence in our culture, sports and recreation? We worship, we build worship stadiums with jumbotrons in the middle and end zones or diamonds or goals, and we can fill those up very quickly, but we struggle to fill the church. And so how do we compete with, not trying to be flashy, but say football does not give you ultimate purpose and meaning in life if you win a championship. Christ does. Now, Andy, as we kind of wrap up here, I don't want to butcher what you and I were talking about on the phone that toward the end of our conversation yesterday, and I really want you to kind of hit that. I don't want to butcher it, but do you remember that, and can you kind of close us out with some of those thoughts?
I'm trying to recall. I'm sorry.
I'm trying to remember myself. It was so good. I was enamored by listening to how you were explaining. I'm like, oh, this is really good when you put it in the class, and I didn't actually type it out, and I was like, I hope
Oh
they don't-
yeah. Well, the danger of any time we do culture engagement, I think that's what we're talking about. Is I'll give you an example. Natural law. If you guys are familiar with natural law, we believe that because God is the creator of nature, that the law is written on our hearts, so to speak. So people in all cultures know that murder is wrong. For example, there's that sense of this is wrong. And so the point that we were talking about, the danger in all of this is. While it's all good, and I think God has called us to engage culture, to be in it and be for it, um, I don't think we're really being for Christ if we allow what we do to be labeled as syncretistic. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of non-believers that are doing a lot of good things, and in some ways doing them better than Christians. And that being said, we need to remember that in Romans, uh, both the Gentiles and the Jews were under the wrath of God, not because they thought they were bad, but because they thought they were good and they were building something. If that makes sense. And so an example, I was trying to talk about natural law, is there are people that in the 1700s even, that were both Christians and non-Christians, that would come together and say, we can agree that by nature we know what's right and wrong. Well, fair enough, but then what happens is nature becomes the ultimate authority and not God, who is a personable, intelligible, knowable being. If that makes sense. There are even atheists now that are buying into morality because of nature. And they're just saying we've evolved to that point to where we realize what is morally significant. Well, if we stop there because we both say murdering is wrong, are we really bearing witness to the gospel? And so that would be the only thing that I would caution us about in our process of engaging culture, is to make sure that we also have a, quote, countercultural spirituality, if that makes sense. It is. I haven't either. I haven't either. And again, please don't hear me say that's negating what you said, and that we should be involved in culture, but just realize the dangers, that there are Buddhists, there are Muslims, there are Jehovah Witnesses, and a lot of other folks that are doing a lot of fantastic things, and we need to bring attention to the fantastic Christ,
Right.
who is truly unique.
Yeah, fantastic doesn't always equal gospel.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, man, Andy, thank you so much for your time the last 2 weeks. I know this has been a benefit for me. I know it has been for the students. So thanks again
been
for
for
your
me.
time. And man, you know that we'll have you in this class again. So
Thank you.
And we're going to sign off, and then we'll go head on and get the rest of our drink coffee. That's what Matt said.
Have a good day.
All right, Andy, thank you, sir. Take care, buddy.
Yeah, thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.